Hey everyone, this is Professor Snart checking in. A little bit later than I would have liked for this unit, but I'll try to talk a little bit about Unit 4, but also Unit 5, which is actually one of our first workshop unit. And I've mentioned before that the workshops are really kind of the heart of this creative writing course. So it's good that really I can talk a little bit more in advance about Unit 5 than I might otherwise do. So just checking into our due dates here, you'll notice that Unit 4 is due Thursday, January 30th, which is actually when I'm recording this, so I really don't have much to say about that unit. Hopefully it was relatively straightforward. My week, and maybe yours as well, got a little thrown off with the school cancellation days. It doesn't really affect our class per se, but as I'm sure you experienced, it affects just about everything else, whether it's having kids home from school, or the car doesn't start, or pipes burst, or just all kinds of crazy stuff. Only some of those things happen to me, not all. But anyway, so Unit 4, I just click us into. I know a number of you have done it already, but I can make just a couple of comments, maybe sort of some takeaways, whether you've done the assignment or not. So we started with this theory of short stories, which is probably fairly familiar to you, even if you've never thought about this kind of thing before. And of course it applies to, so many genres of, whether it's film, short story, novels that we read. And it's a kind of generic pattern that often we see in place where we have this initial, kind of attention getter phase, the rising climax idea, and then this kind of moment. And then sometimes a story will really end quite abruptly after that, and other times there'll be what's called a denouement, sort of this falling action towards the end. And so it's really so generic that it fits so many different kinds of things. It's in some ways not particularly helpful, except to be aware of whether you're subscribing to the pattern when you do write your own stories, or if you deviate, do you deviate in successful ways? So it's not like a pattern that you have to follow, but it is a pattern that you should be aware of, and is kind of fun to read for when we read other stories, which is of course what I had you do in the next folder here, the reading phase. So you can kind of think, did that pattern hold true for these stories, or did the author deviate? And if the author got away from the pattern, was it successful, or would you have made the same choices or different choices? And then of course the writing assignment is really an abbreviated kind of short story, but it's really fun, I think. It centers around these little tchotchkes and this fun audio program from a show called Marketplace, where, as is explained in the unit, these valueless items, they might have had kind of like personal emotional value for individuals, but they didn't have any kind of public value. Because they were given these interesting backstories, they suddenly took on a much greater public value, not just a sentimental individual value. And you can, from the examples, read, and from what I've read, a number of people have posted here, the best stories, or the best backstories that were created, are always the ones that are the most detailed. So it's a really good lesson to learn, and again, is really applicable for the writing that we're doing. Maybe ironically or counterintuitively, to reach the widest audience, it actually helps to be more specific and detailed, not less. So if you write in this kind of universal, bland, generic language, instead of reaching lots of people that way, you really don't connect with any people. So in order to be universal, you have to be very specific. Again, sort of counterintuitive, but that lesson really comes to life in the significant objects exercise. Because the more specific that backstory, whether it's names, geographic locations, kind of surprising little oddities or details that people throw in, that's what becomes really, that's what grabs people's interest. So something really important to think about. So anyway, a fun exercise. Hopefully you had fun doing it, finding a weirdo tchotchke. There's a couple of really creepy ones up there, but anyway, you can it almost doesn't matter. The odder the little trinket you find, the better the exercise seems to work. One thing, again, maybe before I leave this to take away is that the purpose of the assignment here was not to tell a story about why this particular object is meaningful for you, which is talked about in the unit here, so you would have already kind of gotten this information. In other words, you don't want to tell a story about how this thing is meaningful for you because your mother owned it and your grandmother owned it and that's kind of it. It just has this family lineage. Sure, that's meaningful for you, but why would anybody else be interested in that? The trick is to develop this story, right, to make up a story behind the object that gives it some wider kind of public value or public interest, which is, of course, the whole point of the book and the show, or the show excerpt here from the Marketplace episode. Okay, anyway, back to our due dates, because now they change a little bit as we enter our first workshop, which means Unit 5, the workshop units have 2 dates associated with them, as you can see here. A posting date, which means that this is the date that you finished that piece of writing and posted it into your the appropriate discussion board. You'll see yourself in a group and you can find exactly where in Unit 5. You have to have done that on time in a file that people can access to get credit, to get the points for it. So I mentioned before, the grading in the class really isn't based on the quality of the writing per se. Obviously, there has to be some investment, like you tried and made an effort. But I'm really just looking for, is the post there? Is it on time? Is it accessible for your group? The next date that you'll see associated with Unit 5 is, in fact, the next Thursday, Feb 13. So an entire week goes by here. Your primary work for that week is to read everybody's story from your group who posted on time, and then provide detailed comments. And you can see one of the things that I've asked you to do as part of the units here is to review how the workshops work. So it really reiterates all the stuff I'm saying here. Posting on time, posting as a file, how to find your, the right place for you to post, clicking into your group here, replying to the post as a way of beginning your own, and then attaching the file. So you're kind of walked through it. And then the feedback part, you can do a couple of different ways, but it has to be feedback that's in and throughout the document. It can't be just generic, like something at the end, I really liked your story, or I thought the beginning wasn't so good. So the examples here you really have to follow, whether you use the comment feature in a word processor, or like this person just used highlighting and square brackets. They've written directly in and throughout the story, pointing both to strengths, specific strengths, but also areas that they think could be improved. So you want to focus on both of those things. So that's sort of the practical how do the workshops work. But you'll also find lots of kind of information to get you going about, what's the most useful sort of feedback to provide. And the good thing about this is not only are you giving feedback, but of course you're getting it on your piece of writing, your short story as well. So you kind of know already what kind of feedback is going to be useful for you. I mean, obviously you want to take that to make the piece of writing better. So you don't want just some generic, bland, hey, this is great, or, well, it was okay, not my style, but like that's not useful. So really the golden rule applies, and you already know, how best to give feedback because you're on the receiving end of it as well as the giving end of it. So to wrap things up here, now is a really important time to review due dates so you see what's coming up. Review things like the rules of creative writing and how the workshops work, and then really focus in on both the practical, like when you have to post and where, and also how to effectively give feedback at this point. There's no subject that you have to write about, so it's open-ended. It has to be short fiction. We'll do other genres later. There's kind of some length indications here, but the real thing to keep in mind is that you're in a group of 5 people or maybe more, something about that. So you don't want to give people a 40-page short story that you've been writing forever. It's just too much for people to deal with. So keep that in mind as well. You also don't want to just give one page in a story that's mostly in your mind and then hope people will kind of do the rest of the work for you. So the draft that you submit should be sort of in the middle of the writing process. It's fully fleshed out and more or less complete, but it's by no means perfect because, of course, you're looking for feedback, which is kind of related to another, aspect of workshops, is that you have to go in hoping for and looking for feedback. So don't take a story that you wrote years ago that you've written and rewritten and revised and you think is mostly perfect. That's not really going to impress me or the people in your group, and it's going to defeat the purpose of the workshop because you're probably not really open to a lot of commentary on it. So why bother, right? So it's a little bit, there's that gray area between finished short story and just very rough draft, and that's the kind of place you want to be with whatever you're working on. By all means, if you have questions or concerns as you begin to write and develop this short story, be in touch with me and really review and take to heart this rules of creative writing piece here, and make sure that you're really thinking of kind of applying those concepts to the writing that you're doing. All right, so I look forward to reading everyone's tchotchke backstory, your significant object story for Unit 4, and of course getting into our first workshop for Unit 5.